hard, and we needed to close the office. So I had a very tough onboarding time with the ECFR, but I feel very happy and privileged where I am now. Before that, I was working for 6 years at the German Council on Foreign Relations, DGAP, where I was heading the Europe program for 4 years. And before that, I was the interim head of a security and defense program, which then ceased to exist, not due to me, but it got replaced by another program. And I was kind of with the Europe department then already. Before that, I was working in the Bundestag for quite some time as a staffer for a German member of parliament. His name is Roderich Kiesewetter. And so just to be very transparent, I'm not affiliated with any party. I'm not a member, but he is from the CDU. And he was back then the spokesperson for disarmament, arms control, and non-proliferation. And that interested me big time. And yeah, I learned a lot in my 1.5, 2 years in the parliament. And before that, I was with DGAP for a very brief period already. And even before that, for a much longer period with the University of Bonn, where I started my career. After I finished my back then magister, so master's degree, I was asked by my advisor to stay on and to become his assistant. And that gave me the opportunity to work at the university and to write my doctoral thesis at the same time, gave me the nice opportunity to pay for it myself and to become independent from my parents' money. And that was actually what I originally wanted to be, a professor at a university, because I took great pleasure in teaching and researching and international relations theory. And so my background already gives you, I think, an idea of my broad interests. So it was always centered around foreign policy and international relations. But I worked a lot on security early on because I was focusing on German foreign policy and American foreign policy. And that brought me naturally to NATO and all things related to that. And I came to the EU topics rather late. I mean, not that late in my career, but only when I took over the Europe program at DGAP. I became basically a person interested in EU stuff, which was not my cup of tea at the university. And I'm not a Brussels bubble person. And that's what I'm interested in now. Security and defense, European security and defense, very much not only in an EU format, but in the European framework, including transatlantic relations and NATO. I also like, US-EU relations more broadly. I like working on that topic very much. I'm interested in, when it comes to regions, especially in the United States, but also in Russia and Central and Eastern Europe. I try, what I did in my career is also to broaden my perspective and to bring basically the EU perspective or internal EU aspects into the security and defense debate. Because what I learned, and then I stopped, but what I learned in previous years is that kind of the boundaries between the different subjects. So what you're working on, if you were basically working on, I don't know, the future of the European Union or security and defense, became increasingly fluid and overlapping. And I think it helps a lot if you get a broad idea of things that are going on, and if you're able to connect different dots, also from outside your original field of expertise. And that's me, And that was very long, but I hope you're still there and still interested.
No, thank you so much for giving us this introduction. I think it's always helpful to know like what the interests are in your background. So this is a great start into the debate.
Now I lost Francesca.
Yeah, I think Francesca, maybe she has an internet connection issue, but I believe she'll be back very, very shortly. Well, for the meantime, I might just gonna take over. Well, yeah, thank you for the introduction. For everybody who's here in today's event, we want to discuss the greatest security policy challenges for Europe, how security policy must be shaped in the future, and what the Russian war of aggression has taught us so far. And we want to kick off the event by asking a few questions, but we highly encourage the audience to participate and to send your own questions to Dr. Puglierin into the chat, and then we might give you the floor. So yeah, Francesca's still not back, but she will be. Maybe to get going, like the day that Russia attacked in Ukraine, the chief general of the German army stated that the Bundeswehr, the army that I'm allowed to lead, is more or less depleted. In fact, the German army has ammunition to defend itself for only 2 days, really, and the war in Ukraine obviously like exposed that weakness and actually made it even worse because now most of our ammunition is going towards Ukraine. So the question to you, like, how was it possible that Germany, as the biggest industrial nation that was still like had a very big military back into the 1990s, has such a destitute defense in February 2022? And maybe you can give us a bit of an overview of like the developments in the last 30 years that led to this point.
Wow, that's a long period. But maybe I start with ideas I have why we ended up where we are right now. I think that especially in Germany, there was this belief that war, kind of the way we see it now in Ukraine, traditional warfare was a thing of the past and of a different century. If you remember, Angela Merkel, even at one point prior to this war starting, said that Vladimir Putin was living in a different century. And so I think the assumption in Germany, but also more broadly in large parts of Europe, was that we are done with wars. Yugoslavia and the kind of was kind of a result of the Soviet Union falling apart. But once we had overcome this, I think the idea was, that we settle our conflicts in Europe peacefully and through negotiations. And I still think about it. It's just an anecdote I wanted to share because in autumn 2021, I think it was November, I had the great pleasure to visit the Museum for Military History in the city of Dresden. And if you have not been, I really recommend it. It's a fantastic museum. It gives an overview, of war and German armies of the past, and it's really impressive. It's very well done. So, and I traveled there because I moderated a discussion with Angela Merkel's security and foreign policy advisor, Christoph Heusgen. And with a friend of mine who happens to work in the Foreign Office, I was brainstorming how to start this discussion and how to make it interesting for the audience. And I was wondering how I could start this discussion. And this friend of mine, who is actually a military person, said, why don't you start with kind of pointing out the surrounding and say, well, with this kind of, we're sitting here, and do you consider it likely that a major war in Europe would be likely again? And I didn't dare to ask that question because sitting there, it really, I myself, even though I thought it was a wonderful question, thought this is maybe a bit too far off. But just a couple of months later, I mean, this question basically came true, and I'm not sure how Christoph Heusgen would have answered it, but I think that in Germany, and there is a very good article which I can recommend by Thomas Bagger. I don't know the exact title, but if you Google Thomas Bagger and 1989, you'll find it. His thesis, and I very much think he has a point there, is that with basically 1989, Germany thought that a new era would begin, and that the EU and basically this model of regional integration would become a role model for other regions and would be the future. There was, I think, the deep belief in German society and amongst political elites, and also going beyond, I don't know, the SPD, which is always bashed for this, but this belief that European security needs to be organized with Russia, inclusive, collective security, and not, that this era of deterrence and defense was basically over. And I think you saw this very much with also Olaf Scholz's efforts until the very last moment to revive the Normandy format, to revive the Minsk II format, to bring Russia on board. And I think until the very last moment, there was this belief in Germany that Russia was a responsible stakeholder somehow, a problematic one who was difficult to deal with, but who was not interested in rocking the boat completely. And I think that was the biggest misjudgment that the Germans made vis-a-vis Putin's Russia, that it was not a status quo power, but that it wanted to revise the order and change the order and not just tweak it here and there. I think there was this mantra in Germany, and I heard it frequently, regardless of what crisis occurred in my personal kind of career, when there were moments like, I don't know, the Libya intervention or whatever, you name it. And people said there is no military solution to it. And even though I think that it's still true when it comes to a lasting, sustainable peace and a solution in our kind of perspective, I think we overlooked that for other actors, there was a solution that could be achieved through military means, like Russia in Syria was very successful, prevented Assad from having to leave his office, stabilized the regime. And if you are not interested basically in a positive peace as an outcome, but if you are interested in getting your interests through, then military solutions can very well work. But I think we very much bought into this idea of complex interdependence. So creating a network of dependencies that would prevent war from happening. And in this idea that kind of the new power instruments of the 21st century are not battle tanks, but are, the economy, technology, artificial intelligence, you name it, soft power, migration, whatever, but that kind of, there are different tools how to impose your will on others, and that tanks are somewhat outdated. And I think, we were, I mean, some more than others were wrong, but this idea to be surrounded by friends, I think became also a very attractive idea for political decision makers in Germany. And just remember that former Defense Minister zu Guttenberg in 2011 voluntarily said we can cut the defense budget by 8 billion euros back then, because we can spare that money, it's no longer needed. And I think it became normal that the Bundeswehr was not fully equipped, and it became a political choice. But I think I would find it hard to blame just one party for it, you know. I know that there's this blame game now, but I think it was a broad consensus amongst
and the way, and the way you describe it also, like, it seems to be like more of like a European trend, like which is like, how would you compare, for instance, Germany's decision to that of other countries? Like, is Germany alone in the fact that they had this mentality of like Wandel durch Handel, like the change through trade? How would you?
So I think in a way, yes, Germany is in a way an outlier. I think Germany and the EU institutions in Brussels are very much a product of of the Second World War, and of this idea that one can overcome the dynamics and overcome certain trends. And so I think, the EU as a project, but also post-war Germany are a counter model to traditional thinking when it comes to how big powers still think about these matters. You see for example, I think where you see the difference most strikingly is when you compare Germany to the UK or France. The UK and France both had basically are former empire states. They have a different strategic approach to things. They have a different strategic culture. The military power is much more considered a normal tool, part of the toolkit. I mean, not a kind of a hammer that you use for every occasion, like, but it's just a different mindset, and you see that in small details. For example, that in the UK it's completely normal that you can study war studies, and that in Germany, I mean, a lot has changed, and there are you can study. I mean, war studies as such you can't study, but it's not only peace and conflict studies, Friedens- und Konfliktforschung any longer, but still it's a completely different approach. But also if you look at, I mean, to be fair, other countries have really cut their defense budget very much as well. For example, Italy as also a bigger country, or Spain, for example. So I think most strikingly, I think the countries at the eastern flank have always been very worried about and very aware of this potential for further escalation. Just consider a country like Finland, I think has a very similar mindset to the Germans, but is very well equipped, has a super reserve, has a functioning army. Or think about Sweden, also not very good when it comes to defense spending, but army is more capable. Sweden has brought back conscription after 2014. So I think Germany, in a way, is somewhat of an outlier or a special country in Europe still, because of our broken history and because we don't have a positive memory of the use of military force. So I mean, the only positive memory we basically have is that military force was used against Nazi Germany. And that I think we all consider a success, that Germany was beaten and that the Allies, were successful. But that kind of that German soldiers on the ground changed things for the better is still a thought that I think for many Germans it's not a natural it's not a natural way of thinking things through. Although I think that German soldiers have, after 45, contributed to international stability. But yeah, it's just a different way of framing things.
Maybe this is an interesting point to take on, like, what do you think has changed over the last year? I mean, you described like what has led to this, and I mean the difficulties and the challenges. Interesting also that you compare Germany to Finland, because looking at the defense capabilities, it's very different. But what would you say has happened since the war? Do you think there was a shift in awareness, or also in realizing what we need?
So, but maybe just to clarify what I meant with Finland, Finland is also a country like Germany, very interested in the so-called rules-based international order, very interested in multilateralism, very committed to finding peaceful solutions, very ready to negotiate. But that did not come at the expense of basically the other pillar, so hard security and kind of readiness and the possibility to defend the country. I think because of the long border with Russia, but also kind of this idea that war was a thing of the past, I think never occurred to the Finns in the same way. Although when it comes to how they see the world, they are not like France or the UK, kind of a former empire, a big power. They don't have this big power thinking or great power mindset, but still they did not neglect their armed forces. I think that is something when it comes to the bigger countries that, I mean, it's not unique for Germany. As I said, there are others, when you look at the NATO 2% goal, there are not many countries that are reaching it, but I think there is a special German way. And I think that when the war started, serious rethinking started in Germany. And in a nutshell, I think a lot has been a lot has changed. Just two numbers. I think it's really from 5,000 helmets to 18 Leopard 2 tanks in less than a year, I think is quite impressive when it comes to how much Germany has left its comfort zone and has broken taboos of the past. Still, I think what we are seeing now, after more than a year of Zeitenwende and the war, is that although Germany has changed a lot, I think we see big steps forward, I would say. I mean, other people, and we can debate this, would argue that this is not a step forward, but a step backward. I would still say we came a long way. And we have developed into a more responsible country. We still, I think, have a long way to go, and 1 year is not a lot of time. So I think what we really would need to observe is a long-term shift in mindset. And I'm not so sure how much that has sunken in. I think, yes, the train basically has left the station, if you want. But for me, kind of a massive policy change needs to win at least one election in order, and needs to be independent of one specific government in order to be sustainable. And I think that the real questions are still in front of us. So this government has taken a lot of money in its hand for defense, but also for other areas, and has basically tried to solve each and every problem through more money. The problem is that we are running out of money, and there will be kind of the need to prioritize. And Boris Pistorius is right when he says that he needs 10 billion more this year, but it's not only this year, it's kind of really a long-term perspective. And the defense budget needs to rise, we need to invest more. But of course, if there is not more money in the overall pot, other things need to be cut. And there will be, I think, a harsh debate about what are our priorities, what is really important for Germany, in what should we invest, what kind of country do we want to become. And this has only started, because so far, yes, to see kind of German Leopard tanks in Ukraine is difficult to swallow for many, also including in my family. But I think so far, the costs of all of this have not been felt. And if that changes, I'm not sure what the priorities of the next government will be, especially if we come back to somewhat stable, whatever security situation in Europe. So that would be my short answer. So I think we have achieved a lot, we have come a long way, we have questioned a lot of approaches, also change through trade, Wandel durch Handel. But then again, I mean, look at China and look at business trips and business delegations and what is said. And sometimes I'm just doubting how much of that lesson we have really learned.
No, thank you so much for this answer, and also like describing the change that happened. I think you mentioned that, a lot has to happen still. And maybe one question, and after this, I would love to give the floor to the audience, because we have some very interesting questions coming in. Maybe one thing would be, do you think there is currently any plan in Germany of, how, like you mentioned Boris Pistorius, is there like a realistic plan of what has to happen in the next 10 years to, really secure European defense and German defense and security? And maybe then what would you say needs to happen to also convince the German population, or a majority in a democratic society that this is the right path, like if we spend more on the military? And then we'll give the floor to the audience.
So is there a sustainable plan? I think if you asked experts, pretty well what would be needed to make the Bundeswehr capable again, or more capable again. It's not as if they are not capable at all. I think sometimes we misportray that, including think tankers who always talk about the miserable state of the German armed forces. That is true, but still, I mean, this army, of course, has also highly specialized forces and can still do a lot of things. But so what would be needed in theory is actually an idea what Germany's the mission statement for the German military should be. And here the problem already starts. So Olaf Scholz has said that it's now all about territorial defense, and he wants to make Germany a guarantor for European security, which I think is a great goal and should be also Germany's role to guarantee European security, also to reassure countries in Central and Eastern Europe to do more to deter Russia. But I just remember a couple of years ago, I mean, we thought before 2014, territorial defense was no longer needed, and it was all about out-of-area missions. And I agree that the balance sheet for out-of-area missions has not been super when you look at Afghanistan or Mali. But still, I would not rule out that there needs to be kind of crisis management in the future, especially maybe also within the EU framework or within an UN framework. And the problem is that so far, or in the past, the idea was really to have a full spectrum army, an army that could do many different things. Now, but in practice, we had shifted a lot back from territorial, away from territorial defense to out-of-area missions, and now the pendulum swings back. In theory, yeah, it would be really about what missions does the German army want to do in the future, what kind of military actor does Germany want to become, and then equipping the Bundeswehr accordingly. The problem is Germany was ready to fight war of its choice, like Afghanistan or Mali, but is not ready still to fight wars of necessity. So the moment Germany gets attacked, and Pistorius was very clear about this, Germany would be unable to defend itself on its own. I mean, luckily we are in a military alliance, but the role of the United States in all of this is really crucial and just became more important in the war. So, but I think what we really still don't have is this idea of what kind of military actor Germany should be. I mean, there are indicators, as I said. Olaf Scholz is pretty clear about the priorities, and I think the priorities right now is really territorial defense for Germany, but also for the NATO territory. And then, yeah, nobody talks about the rest. And I'm just wondering when this will come back and haunt us, because so far I don't see NATO investing very much in I don't know, counterterrorism or whatever. And admittedly, we haven't been very successful there. But what is clear is that if you want to build up the German army again, you need to have a kind of solid financial planning, midterm financial planning, which we don't see at the moment. And you would need to see a constant rise of the defense budget, also in order to achieve the 2% goal, which is now the absolute minimum of what needs to be done. And I see a lot of German decision makers publicly stating that, yes, Germany will reach the 2% goal, but we haven't reached it in 2022. We will not reach it this year. We'll see if Boris Pistorius succeeds in 2024.
Yeah, there are some interesting questions regarding the so-called Sondervermögen, which are like the 200 million, I think, that have been pledged in order to renew the German
100 billion.
The German military.
Not
100 billion, sorry.
100,
yeah.
100
billion, yeah. Basically what that also means, like long-term for the German defense budget. You already mentioned a few other interesting things, such as NATO and the US, and it's important for the European security. And we have a question from Alejandra Avendado. Sorry, I hope I didn't butcher your name. And she asked for us to ask the question for her. And essentially it's about, she's asking whether you believe that the EU is moving towards establishing a more common EU military, or do you think that's like an impossibility? I know that you've mentioned in a podcast interview that the idea of discussing European autonomy, which has become such a buzzword, is a bit like beating a dead horse. Where is your pessimism rooted at? And like maybe can you elaborate a bit on the European pillar of NATO?
So I think there are different things here. First, I think that the Europeans need to get better in coordinating their defense efforts urgently. So I'm very much on board with everything that the Commission has done in the past since 2016. I think the European Defense Fund is a good idea, the CARD process, the EDF process, PESCO, the European Peace Facility, you name it. All these initiatives are very good. Everything, and also what the heads of state and government stated a year ago in the Versailles summit, that they want to spend better, and that not only more, but more coordinated, that they want to invest jointly, that they don't want to have so much duplication. All this is super. Problem is, and if you do European security and defense policy, it really feels like Groundhog Day, many days a year, because you still see this very same debates that we've seen, I don't know, 5 years ago or 8 years ago or 2 years ago. And that makes me so pessimistic. So I think there is really that. So what I think the EU should do is to concentrate on capability development and kind of joint procurement, aligning these processes better. But what I think we will not see, because there is just no appetite from member states, is something like a European army or anything of that kind. I don't see the EU as an actor in territorial defense as long as NATO is still functional. And what we've seen in the war, Russia's war against Ukraine, is that NATO has become just so much more important for the Europeans, and the United States so much more influential and important in Europe. I think this is a dangerous development. Although I think Emmanuel Macron does everything to undermine his claims by the way he presents it, by his divisive rhetoric, but on substance, his call for more autonomy is right, that he says, look, it is really not sustainable that we are dependent on a couple of thousand voters in the United States, in some swing states, every 4 years, and we get a heart attack each time. And I think something in 2016 really changed, because until then, I think most people in Europe took the American security guarantee for granted. Speech of previous defense ministers have addressed the topic, but were not taken seriously. Trump was a wake-up call, but now, to me, Joe Biden, although I think the current US government does a tremendous job, but the danger is a bit that we take this as a sleeping pill and go back to sleep. What I think there are two camps in Europe. There is one camp in Central and Eastern Europe, particularly, but also in the Nordics, that say we cannot do without the United States. We trust the United States more than France and Germany to guarantee for our own security, and we do everything, or nearly everything, to keep the US engaged in Europe. And then you have another camp, especially France, but also other countries, and Germany is somewhere in the middle, more in the Atlanticist camp, I would say, but saying, no, we need to be more able to do things on our own. The thing is, how you merge this best, in my view, is that you make an argument saying, okay, I understand that I cannot build strategic autonomy, which is a divisive topic for many, against the United States. So maybe we frame the argument differently and say we Europeans need to become more capable in the transatlantic alliance, so that we are just a stronger pillar in this alliance, and also this way create hedges. So the moment another Trump is elected, that kind of this one pillar is able to stand on its own, or maybe that this pillar is even able to keep NATO alive with a deadlocked United States. And we are not there yet, but so my hope is not really to build EU defense, but to make the EU an enabler for a better European defense. When it comes to resilience, the EU, I think, will still be the organization for crisis management, but also when it comes to capability. So I think the Commission has put money to the table to incentivize European companies to work together. It's all also dependent on the member states, and I don't see enough willingness there. The problem is, like, look at the Germans. They now have this big pot of money, and what they do is to fill the gaps quickly. So they decide, okay, we want to have functioning material quickly, so we buy off the shelf, and that is available in the United States or in Israel or South Korea. Instead of investing that money to develop joint European projects like the FCAS. So now we buy the F-35, or we want to do both, but the French are really worried that we just, because these are long-term investments. So everything we buy now from the United States has a past dependency. So, but I would say we are there is no good way out of this. And to me, the solution is really to make European security and defense better, and to overcome also this artificial boundaries between the EU and NATO, bringing the UK on board, and just the Europeans as such being more able and capable of acting on their own, not against the United States, not because they are aiming for a divorce, and also really kind of not in a sense of equidistance between China and the United States, but basically following Plan A, stronger NATO, but having Plan B also in mind. If everything collapses, we are able to stand on that one pillar. That would be my vision. But it's really,
yeah.
CSDP is a frustrating topic if you want to get into it in your studies.
I bet. You mentioned a lot of good things, like many things that I think we can also could talk hours about. One thing that I found interesting that might connect to like a bit of an audience question here is you talk about hedges and basically being a bit more independent of the US if, for instance, like another Trump is elected and decides to like leave NATO or something like that. Alexandra has a question regarding aid to Ukraine, and I would quickly ask Alexandra to unmute herself and to ask a question.
Great. Thank you so much for the opportunity. I hope everybody can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for your interesting points so far. I remember listening to a podcast the other day where they said that the new aid that was pledged to Ukraine in terms of military, but also humanitarian assistance has decreased in the past few months. And I was just wondering what the reasons are for this development, and whether you see this as a trend that kind of confirms this concern that has been talked about for months, that the West is kind of getting war fatigue, that people, the support is just diminishing over time. Thank you.
It would be interesting what podcast that was and what the real numbers are. So I know that the Kiel tracker had reported about a drop of commitments in the past, but when you look at, for example, Germany, there are also encouraging signals. So kind of 2 weeks ago, I think it was, or 3 weeks ago, the German Bundestag basically allocated 12 billion euro to build up Ukraine, or to help Ukraine militarily. It was about military aid specifically, not only this year and next year, for I think it is until 2031 or 2032. I'm not really sure, but I think there is still a lot of commitment. But of course, you are right to be worried. First, I think the war has shown us, as I said, how dependent we are still on the United States, and I wish it was different. But and I think the Europeans have stepped up, some countries more than others. But I think the Europeans could have done more. But just look at the tank saga, where I played some role, fortunate or unfortunate role, remains to be seen. But so for the Europeans to get 62 battle tanks to Ukraine seemed to be too much of an effort or a stretch. And yeah, I think that, what you see is militarily that many European countries, and not only Germany, coming back to our previous question, have basically reduced their military capabilities or cut their military capabilities to the bones. And so, for example, in the UK, the Challenger, or in France, the Leclerc, are no longer produced. So I think there is a problem with sustainability when it comes to sending military equipment, because it needs to be not only procured, but it needs to be constructed first. So, and to build a Leopard 2 tank takes kind of today 36 months. This is a very long time. So I think there is a problem when it comes to supplying Ukraine and the Europeans, because we talked about ammunition, we can talk about, it's not only tanks, it's really a broad spectrum. That worries me. The US, and they run into problems too, but have more abilities, military capabilities to, they just are a more sustainable supplier. Let's put it like this. When it comes to humanitarian or financial aid, I still think that the Europeans are pretty committed. But of course, as coming back to elections and the uncertain future, of course, there are trends like so-called war fatigue, which I think is kicking in now. I think for the first year we haven't seen it, but now also when you look at the media and coverage and other topics, I think the war is not forgotten, but it's not front and center each and every day. But I think the European Commission is really committed, but it really depends also how this war ends, if it ends, when it ends, under which conditions and circumstances. Yeah. But I would not be so pessimistic, because this, I mean, the European Union has made a commitment to Ukraine, and the buildup of Ukraine needs to take place. But yeah, coming back to what I said in the beginning about priorities and where to put your money, and if there are competing goals and elections to win, that is all a risk. That's why we need to raise awareness whenever we can, I think, also including us think tankers.
Great, thank you very much.
Yeah. Francesca?
Yes, I mean, I can ask the question from Andre from the audience as well. So maybe here on this occasion, he's asking, do you think that politicians in Germany, but not only in Germany, really believe when they say that Ukraine can liberate all its territories? Or do you envisage a compromise? I think this question is more on, the future of the war, if you have.
But it may be connected a little bit with also like your proposal to like basically send heavier weapons to Ukraine in order to make something happen. So I would be curious to like, maybe
to maybe
the outlook.
Exactly, to speak from your own experience as an expert, what your contribution was and why you were convinced that sending tanks was important.
So the war had different phases, and I have to admit that in the very beginning, I was as worried as many others that Russia would overrun Ukraine quickly, and I was not very hopeful. So I think I was very much in sync with Olaf Scholz when he gave the Zeitenwende speech. It was a lot about NATO and basically deterring Russia, and it was about sending weapons to Ukraine. But I think at that point, the Chancellor did not really think that we needed to sustain military aid for Ukraine over such a long period, and maybe even longer. But then I think it became clear pretty early on in the war that Russia has made a mistake, and Ukraine was incredibly capable and brave. And I think the decision that Zelensky took to stay in Kiev and not to leave the country was very crucial. And then you saw, after basically the Russians had to withdraw from Kiev and the north and needed to regroup in the Donbass, that there was a chance to get back territory, and that the Ukrainians were excellent in the way they conducted this war, and that the resilience also of the broader society was amazing. So I and colleagues at ECFR, but also colleagues in other think tanks thought, okay, if this is going to be a longer war, we need to make the support for Ukraine sustainable. And then the problem was that our first reaction, I think, was also a good one, or kind of this idea of this swap exchange, Ringtausch in Germany, so that you basically try to free Soviet-style tanks and send them to Ukraine, and or Soviet-style heavy weapons in general, which the Ukrainians could operate without the need to train them. And this was all Plan A. And it was all not fast enough for me, but that's a different story. But then, if you thought things through early on, it was clear, it was absolutely clear that these stocks, the old Soviet stocks, would not be endless, but that there was a natural end to what we could send to Ukraine, and that basically the challenge was to send Western material that could be reproduced, and where you could find the necessary ammunition in the West. And so, and also, I think the idea was that there is a limited amount of time, and there was this window of opportunity in the autumn for Ukraine when they had these counteroffensives in Kharkiv and Kherson, where they were able to take back territory. And the idea was to equip Ukraine for that very moment. And as I said, this war is very cost intensive when it comes to human lives, but also when it comes to capabilities. Ukraine, and also Russia, but Ukraine loses all sorts of tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, transport vehicles, you name it, on a daily basis. And just to make it sustainable, our idea was to bring the West in and quickly, and to use the time which was then on Ukraine's side, because it's easier if you are once also in the offensive to keep going. If you give Russia the time to build trenches and to basically to lock themselves in, it's much more difficult. And that was then the idea, to push a debate in the West for a sustainable strategy to support Ukraine. I think we are not really there yet, because it has been very much an ad hoc operation. So countries meeting in Ramstein, just looking what was needed immediately and what they could do. But what we thought would be necessary would be a long time strategy to support Ukraine, kind of thinking, okay, like now, for example, already half a year ago, if they want to go into the offensive again, what do they need then? And to enable them and train them for that moment. And that's why
I think
came up with the tanks.
I think you make a lot of good points with like the reaction thus far being very reactionary and not necessarily like thinking strategically ahead. So I think let's hope that maybe,
No, there was this question about what Ukraine is able to get back. And I have to say, I'm not sure. I don't know. I think this war has had a lot of changes already. As I said in the beginning, many experts thought Ukraine had no chance. Then there was this period of, I think, over-optimism. Mm-hmm. Now I think this counteroffensive is very important for Ukraine, because I think what kept the support for Ukraine alive was also to see Ukraine winning and getting that territory. So I think but for me personally, but I'm in no position to define this, for Ukraine to win the war, it would not mean to get back everything, including Crimea. I could imagine a settlement which would put Crimea under a Hong Kong style arrangement or whatever. But I very well understand that Ukraine cannot give up Crimea right now, because it's also important for the negotiations. And you have to understand that Crimea is a strategically important point. So if you have Russia basically having hubs at Crimea, Ukraine does not feel safe, and I can understand this. So I think there would be kind of the need for kind of some demilitarized Crimea, which the Russians will never agree to if they keep Crimea. So I don't know. I just hope for the best, and I hope that we equip Ukraine the best possible way to do this counteroffensive. I think it's good that the Leopards are there and the challengers, but it's very hard.
Yeah, thank you so much for the answer. We have a question by Emily, which connects a little bit to what we talked about earlier regarding Europe and a common European defense policy. Emily, do you want to ask a question yourself? Should we give you the floor?
Yeah, thank you so much. It's really interesting, and we've talked a lot about Ukraine already. And I was wondering now, with all the different stances different European countries have, if it's really realistic to find a common strategy, because you have, for example, Austria that claims to remain neutral, and France with Macron trying to distance himself more from the US, and then Poland helping a lot. And so I was wondering how realistic it is to find a common European strategy.
For Ukraine or more broadly?
More broadly, but like also regarding now Ukraine, I think it shows all these differences. So I was wondering more broadly, like how would a military common strategy work if already now there's so many differences?
No, I mean, you're perfectly right on the differences. I try to also bring the kind of Atlanticist and the post-Atlanticist camp in here. And but then, I mean, let's look at it from a hopeful perspective. If you look at what France really wants and basically what Poland really wants, of course, they have a different idea about the engagement of the United States and how much they want to work with the United States, but they both have this idea. And they are, I think, at the opposite ends of the spectrum in the European Union, that Europe needs to be more capable. And if we manage to somehow concentrate on that in a constructive way, I think there is actually some common ground. I would leave Austria and the neutrals aside, but even there a debate has started. Maybe not so much in Austria, although some Austrian colleagues, Franz Stefan Gadi, for example, has just written about the end of kind of the neutral status for Austria. But for example, I've recently been to Dublin, where they have their own debate about what the war means for them and their security. And so I'm actually not that pessimistic, as long as your goal is not to build a European army or to make the EU or to make basically NATO obsolete. I think that is not possible and also not desirable as long as NATO works. But it also so much depends on external circumstances. It can all break down very quickly. Just imagine 2024, another Trump figure, or Trump himself is elected again, wants to leave NATO. That can have two effects. Either the Europeans kind of stick together and think, okay, we want to do it on our own, or you have half of Europe basically doing everything, and maybe even kind of when it comes to domestic policy, being quite happy with what Trump aims for. We had this with Hungary and also the Polish government in the past, that they were quite happy. So, but I think our goal should be, or that's what I try to achieve with my work, is to find common ground for the Europeans. It is not easy, as you said, but I think if you don't push for the extremes, but try to concentrate on, we all want Europe to be able to do more on its own, then we can achieve this together. But of course, I mean, there are divisive factors. The United States is a divisive, or can be a divisive factor. UK is another actor that is super interesting, because now with the war, they have become more relevant in Europe. Again, when it comes to security and defense, they have been working closely with Poland and Ukraine, and they are also offering different frameworks for how to organize European security. For me, it's important that all the different frameworks don't undermine each other, but are kind of, strengthen each other if you take them together. But it's still worth working on it if you consider kind of this as a topic for your studies. I think it's worthwhile. It's super important to me.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Thank you. Thank you for your answer.
Great. I think we're a bit running out of time, so maybe to conclude and maybe final question first on what would you say is the role of experts in the whole debate? Like, how would you say, what's your role in the in influencing the public debate and shaping it? And then maybe one more open question for students. What is your advice to students who are interested in these topics? Like if they want to become an expert, or what are the topics they should look into so we can make Europe more secure for the next decade?
So maybe I start with the last question. I think it's the much more important question for you. So what my advice would be, and that's not only limited to security and defense, it's in Europe, in Germany particularly, but I think also in other countries, difficult because we don't have this revolving door tradition that they have in the United States. But for me, as I said, when I joined parliament, it was really a harsh awakening. I was not familiar with how a party works, party politics, power politics within a party, all this. But I encourage you to not only, if you want to become a think tanker, don't start as a think tanker, do different things. Learn something, go and work in parliament or in a ministry, or kind of take a job